Charlie Kirk changed the lives of millions of American Christians. They're now very angry, and their political opponents are angry too. Anger is a dangerous emotion. It drives us to lash out without thinking of the consequences. And it becomes even more dangerous when it becomes part of a political group, even more dangerous when that political group identifies as a religious group. It drives the group as a whole to lash out, and members of that group, they look at other people in their religious political group and they want them to be angry too. Because if they're not angry and they're not lashing out like them, then there's something lacking in their sincerity. They're hypocrites. Both Christians and Muslims, they need to be wary of this, because both Jesus and Muhammad taught us to restrain our anger. I wanted to share 3 messages from Jesus and Muhammad in this context, for me first and foremost, as a reminder for myself and for my fellow Muslims and for my Christian friends. The first teaching that's common to both Jesus and Muhammad for Christians and Muslims is, don't let your anger prevent you from fearing your own judgment before God. Anger drives us to lash out at people who disagree with us. And if we're religious, Muslim or Christian, then that lashing out is always preceded by a judgment of them. Contempt. They're wrong. They're disobeying God. They're going against God. They're with Satan. This kind of judgment, with it comes a contempt. You look down on somebody and you put yourself up. You make yourself feel great by putting somebody else down. America is a great country, but sometimes when I look on my social media feeds, I read some content by some Christians. It seems like this is what they're doing. It seems like they're having contempt. They're judging somebody else. They're looking down upon them, and they're using that contempt to make themselves feel great. And that doesn't seem to fit with what Jesus is reported to have said in some of his most famous words in the Gospel of Matthew, when he said, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure that you used, it will be measured to you." This is true religion. True religion teaches me to fear my own judgment before God, because I'm not without blame. I'm a sinner. And one day I will stand in judgment before God. And on that day, I will want Him to have mercy on me, to pardon my trespasses. And so when I look at somebody who disagrees with me, instead of judging them and putting them down, I will treat them in the way that I want God to treat me. The closest disciple of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his name was Abu Bakr. Like Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abu Bakr was extremely generous. He used to support many people who were poor. Among them was a relative of his name was Mistah. He couldn't support himself. Abu Bakr used to support him from his own wealth. Mistah, he participated in a campaign of slander against the daughter of Abu Bakr. And Abu Bakr, he was upset, and he thought the natural thought that any one of us would think, I supported him, I gave him money, and this is what he does to me? He's taking advantage of my kindness. He's taking advantage of my generosity. And so he swore an oath. He said, I swear by God, I will never give you anything again. But when Abu Bakr did that, God revealed verses in the Quran about him, encouraging him to forgive his relative Mistah and to continue giving him money, to continue supporting him. There's a very important part of this verse that I want to reflect on here. It says, God says to Abu Bakr, أَلَا تُحِبُّونَ أَنْ يَغْفِرَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ? Don't you want God to forgive you? Don't you fear your own judgment before God? And Abu Bakr, he said, indeed, I do want God to forgive me. And so he returned to supporting Mistah God was teaching him through the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam not to judge other people and fear your own fate before God. Don't have contempt for other people and treat other people as you would want God to treat you. That's what Jesus is reported to have said in the Gospel of Matthew. Don't judge others, or you too will be judged. In another, even more famous verse, it's part of the Lord's Prayer. Christians all over the world say this, and they ask God to forgive us our trespasses as we forgive the trespasses of other people. That's what the Prophet ﷺ was teaching his closest disciple, Abu Bakr, in the Quran, because this is part of our shared religious heritage between Christians and Muslims. The next couple of verses in the Gospel of Matthew are also part of our shared religious heritage. In these verses, Jesus is reported to have said, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eyes?" In other words, you go to someone and you say, "There's something wrong with you. Look, there's a speck in your eye." But you neglect the fact that you yourself have so many faults. It's not just a speck in your eye. It's as though there's an entire log, as though there's an entire plank. And so the next verse in the Gospel of Matthew, it says, "How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye?" Before you judge other people, judge yourself. And when you do that, you'll see that you have a lot to worry about. And that will distract you, your worry for your own fate. It'll distract you from judging other people. That's what Jesus taught. That's what the Prophet Muhammad taught. That's what Abu Bakr, the closest disciple of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he did when the verses of the Quran that I just shared with you were revealed about him. This was actually a common proverb that was circulating widely amongst the Prophet's disciples. Abu Huraira, he said that one of you sees the qadat, which means a speck in the eye of his brother, and he doesn't see the jidl or jidha, which means log. He doesn't see the log in his own eye. It's transmitted from Abu Huraira. There's another companion as well, it's transmitted from him as well. And it was a statement that was circulating amongst the early Muslims, because this is something that they learned from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they lived by it. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that of all of the prophets, I resemble Jesus the most. So what this means is that the way that Christians and Muslims, they become great is not by having contempt for somebody else and using that contempt to create an imagination in my mind that I'm really great, I'm really strong, I'm really powerful. That's not the way, because I'm not great. Only God is great. The way that we become great is by obeying God and humbling ourselves before God. And that's why the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Man tawada'a lillah, rafa'ahu Allah." Whoever lowers themselves, humbles themselves before the commands of God, that is the one who God will raise. That is the one who God will make great in the eyes of other people. Both Jesus and Muhammad, may God's blessings and peace be upon them both of them were humble, and that's how they were raised in the eyes of other people. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was humble too. He was a messenger of God. He was the head of state, but he chose to act like a slave. He would go to the marketplace himself. He would buy and sell in the marketplace himself. He would carry his own groceries. A little girl, little children could come. They could take him by the hand, lead him wherever they wanted to take him. He would eat while sitting on the ground. He used to milk sheep with his own hands. He would repair his own clothes. He would repair his own shoes. He would stroke the heads of children to show them mercy. And he used to sit with his disciples as though he was one of them, not distinguished from them in any way, so that when a stranger entered, the stranger would have to ask, "Which one of you is Muhammad?" So Christians and Muslims, we don't become great by feeding our anger and judging other people. Rather, we become great by humbling ourselves before God. The second reflection that I'd like to remind myself and my fellow Muslims and my Christian friends, that's part of our shared religious heritage at this moment in time, is don't let your anger prevent you from forgiving other people. Anger, it drives us to lash out at other people. And especially when it's a group anger, then the other side looks like the enemy. We treat them as the enemy. And we look at them as a group that we have to fight and defeat. But that's not what Jesus taught. In the Gospel of Matthew, he's reported to have said that you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ taught that too. That's why he taught Abu Bakr to forgive Mistah. And there's many verses in the Quran that convey the same message. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَلَا تَسْتَوِي الْحَسَنَةُ وَلَا السَّيِّئَةُ. Good deeds, kindness, and bad deeds, insults, are not the same. إِدْفَعْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنَ السَّيِّئَةُ. Respond to other people's bad deeds, respond to other people's aggression, other people's curses, other people's insults. Respond to that with that which is better. Respond to it with a good deed. فَإِذَا الَّذِي بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَهُ عَدَاوَةٌ كَأَنَّهُ وَلِيٌّ حَمِيمٌ. And suddenly you will find that the person between whom you and him there is enmity, suddenly you'll find that he's your closest friend. You will win over their hearts. And that's how Christians and Muslims are supposed to defeat their enemies. They're supposed to win them over with kindness and forgiveness, even though they are being aggressive against them. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, this was his greatest victory. Towards the end of his mission, he entered Mecca victorious, and all of the people who had persecuted him, they stood before him helpless in his grasp. And he gave a victory speech that no one in recorded history has ever given before. You can find out about that victory speech by clicking on the link in the description below. This was the greatest victory of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The most important part of that victory speech is that he forgave everyone. He forgave all of his enemies. And when he did that, he won them over and they became Muslim in huge numbers. And that's how the Prophet ﷺ, that's how his mission was successful. He defeated his enemies through forgiveness. The third reflection that I have for myself and for my fellow Muslims and my Christian friends, it's on a concept that is common to the Quran and the Old Testament. It's called sakina. In Hebrew, it's called shekhinah. In the Quran, sakina refers to a calmness that descends from God into the hearts of those who are struggling against people who are persecuting them. And this calmness, it descends into their hearts and it does away with fear and anger. Both Jesus and Muhammad, may God bless them both and give them peace, both of them were persecuted. Their followers were persecuted. They were tortured and they were killed. The first disciple of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to be killed was a woman. Her name was Sumayya. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with her. There was an evil man, his name was Abu Jahl. He took a spear and he thrust it into her private parts, and she died a painful death. But neither Jesus nor Muhammad incited their disciples to anger. According to the Gospel of Luke, when the persecution of Jesus reached its peak, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." That's what Jesus was teaching his disciples. And that's what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was teaching too. He's reported to have said these words, these exact words, "O Allah, forgive my people, for they don't know," when they attacked him and his face was bleeding. And he actually taught that there were many prophets. This was a general message from all of the prophets of God, that they don't incite a mob, an angry mob, to anger, but they calm things down and they pray for the forgiveness of their enemies and they teach their followers to do the same. Another disciple of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, his name was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. He said he remembered the Prophet ﷺ relating how one of the previous prophets, he was calling his people to God and they rejected him by beating him, causing his face to bleed. And so he wiped the blood off his face and he said, "Oh God, forgive my people, for they don't know." That doesn't mean that prophets don't struggle against the forces of evil and overcome them. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he struggled against the forces of evil and he overcame them with his forgiveness. And he foretold that in his second coming, Jesus would do the same. He would overcome the forces of evil and defeat them. But that struggle isn't an angry struggle, like the struggle of a mob. The Quran describes this struggle using the word sakina. It's a Hebrew word, shekhinah, and it describes the descent of a calmness, the descent of the presence of God into the heart. In the Old Testament, it describes the descent of the presence of God into the temple of Jerusalem. In the Quran, that same word, it's used to describe the descent of the presence of God, which leads to a calmness in the hearts of the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, his disciples, as they were struggling against the forces of evil. So they don't respond with anger. So they don't respond with fear. Sakina is a calmness that descends in the hearts of people who struggle against evil sincerely for the sake of God, without any selfish motive. It gets rid of anger and fear, and it fills the heart with trust in God, with love of God, with submission to God. And that's what drives their struggle against evil. In the Quran, God says that He sent this sakina down upon the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ just before the battle of Badr. And it purified them. Shekhinah, it has this purification meaning as well in the Old Testament. It purified them and it gave them this calmness and trust in God and moving forward in submission to God, not out of anger at an enemy. The Quran says that this same sakina would descend upon the children of Israel in the same way when they would carry the Ark of the Covenant into their battles. In the Quran, it describes the enemies as not having sakina, but having something else called hamiyya. Hamiyya is tribalism. This was from a time when they used to organize as tribes, extended family. If anybody harms or insults anyone in my family, the entire family gets angry and responds with anger. In our times, tribalism is nationalism, blind nationalism. It's where a group of people who belong to the same nation, they come together and they support each other blindly. If anyone insults or aggresses against any one of them, they respond with a vengeance, with a collective vengeance. And this is really dangerous. It's what led to the Holocaust, and it has nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus or the teachings of Muhammad. May God's blessings and peace be upon them both. And that's why this idea of Christian nationalism, there's something wrong with that. It's very easy for Christians who fall into this movement of Christian nationalism to be co-opted by it. And instead of being moved like Jesus was by love of God, by submission to God, with this calmness and forgiveness, being moved instead by a collective anger and contempt for everybody who disagrees with you. And whenever that happens, our job as Muslims is to avoid saying anything that would inflame that anger. Because our greatest victory would be the greatest victory of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is to win over the hearts of people who might hate us, who might hate the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What's really remarkable about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that the children of his enemies, they became his closest disciples. And whenever that happened, he told his disciples not to mention anything bad about these children's fathers, even though they were enemies. They tortured and they persecuted and they killed the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when Ikrimah, he's the son of Abu Jahl. Abu Jahl is the one who thrust the spear into the private parts of Sumayya, and he watched as she died a painful death. When his son, when he became Muslim towards the end of the mission of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet was overjoyed. When he entered, he got up eagerly to greet him. And before Ikrimah came, he told his disciples, don't mention anything about his father. Because the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he came to win over his enemies. And if he wasn't able to do that, he won over their children. Charlie Kirk has left this world. He didn't know who the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was. We were unable to show him. But millions of people who love him are still here. And they don't know who the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was. Let's not inflame their anger. Let's respond instead in a way that shows them who the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam really was.